Alrighty, today we're going to be reviewing science stock photos. So, stock photos of things happening in a laboratory that are designed based off of what people who make stock photos think are things that happen in laboratories. As you can see here, they've color coded the laboratory to only require a specific reagent of a specific color. That color is a very pretty blue. So, while not the most accurate thing I've ever seen, I would certainly say it looks nice. They're using a pretty nice Mac computer at what is clearly like a bench space. So there's difference between desk area and bench area. Bench area is where you actually conduct experiments and do lab work, and then desk space is where you would have like your computer and papers and kind of more like a desk you would find in a normal job. Some bench work requires a computer, and you're going to find a bench computer. If this is a bench computer, which it clearly is, if you're going to go through the trouble of wearing PPE, which includes a lab coat and goggles, they're clearly working with these reagents, or they wouldn't be wearing these goggles. You're probably not going to neglect to wear gloves. And most bench computers, so computers used at a bench as opposed to a desk, where experiments are actually being done, are going to be used with gloves. Yeah, so that computer is considered like bench contaminated, so you would want to wear gloves when you're using it. Another thing that shows me that they're probably not following the best safety precautions is that her phone is placed right there next to the flask that clearly has some sort of reagent in it. In the spirit of PPE, so that's personal protective equipment, it's what we call lab coats and goggles, and rules that include not eating where you do an experiment and not putting your phone where you do an experiment. They don't have their hair back. That's probably something you would do if you had really long hair and you're working in a lab. You'd want to put your hair back. You have a group of scientists, and they're all staring at what appears to be a chicken next to a carton of 6 eggs. I guess I believe they're scientists. They look kind of science-y, and this guy is clearly Jewish, and maybe her too, so sure. They're not following EULAR regulations or any sort of animal practices regulations. So there's going to be a lot of stuff about the PPE you wear and how you house and do experiments on animals. You probably wouldn't not be wearing gloves. You might even be wearing a special, it kind of looks like surgeon scrubs that you wear over your lab coat or over your clothing. You'd probably be wearing goggles, maybe a hairnet, and probably a face mask too, a face covering that goes over your face. I'm not entirely sure what experiment this would be. So in addition to rating these in terms of safety, I'd also look at functionality. So are they actually accomplishing something? What it actually is happening here? One example of a time I've ever seen an animal just kind of set out on a desk where people weren't properly prepared for the situation. And that was when I was shadowing somebody who was working with mice, and a mouse jumped out of its cage, out of a special hood for working with animals, and actually first onto his body, the person I was working with, and then onto the floor. And we did spend a good half hour or so trying to find this mice around the room. Unfortunately, we're working with immunosuppressed mice, so mice that don't have a proper immune system. And because that mouse was immunosuppressed, by the time we were able to recover it from the room, he had been running around on the floor where you're stepping with your feet. And unfortunately, after that, you just kind of have to sacrifice that mouse, for lack of a better term. This could be some behavioral study where you're just trying to find out what happens when we put a chicken next to a carton of eggs. But ultimately, in my experience, if you're working with an animal, you're probably really concerned about staying sterile around that animal and making sure that you have control over his environment. I also am not entirely sure what's so interesting about this particular chicken that there would be 5 people surrounding him at this particular moment, especially 5 people who are clearly senior scientists. So this is clearly just like someone working at their computer. I guess we're supposed to think she's wearing a lab coat, although it's kind of hard to tell. And maybe she even has a stethoscope, so she's a doctor. You can tell she has a really bougie view. So if you look in the background, she's got a really big window that kind of overlooks a big city. So that's pretty nice. I want to know where she works. First thing, same thing that we've dealt with before, is that you've got like beakers and actual bench stuff. She's clearly using a laptop without gloves. It's a personal computer, and yet it's on a bench where she has kind of nondescript media, nondescript reagents sitting around in beakers because it looks very sciencey. One thing I will say is that I don't know, like next time you walk into your doctor's office, you will probably find that they do have a lot of what appears to be like office stuff next to what appears to be very sciencey stuff. And as you go in and you actually have a checkup, they have to have everything right next to each other. But, I don't understand what's going on the computer. That seems maybe staged, possibly. I don't know. Not sure. The stock photoness here is extreme. I guess like their lab coats maybe seem a little big. So that's something like next time you see a stock photo image, take a look at the lab coats. They're probably wearing lab coats that are too big for them, or men's lab coats, because people who set up the stock photos, I guess, they have the cost image, but they're not necessarily going to get them tailored to fit the model. And for a perfectly feminist, equally racially diverse stock photo of scientists. How do you get your lab coats? That's a good question. When you get assigned to a lab, you'll probably actually go visit, or someone will come to you, someone whose job it is to provide you with the necessary personal protective equipment required to work in your specific laboratory with specifically what you're working for, and that's going to include you getting assigned, let's say, special goggles that fit over prescription glasses. Different types of lab coats. You'll probably get more than one of each type of lab coat because you'll need one to wear when the other one is being washed. And you'll rarely see, there is so many different types of PPE, but many of them don't kind of fit that classic white cotton lab coat that is kind of the most popular, thought of as being the most sciencey lab coat. I have something like somewhere between 3 to 6 lab coats because I do have like the normal lab coat. I also have a blood barrier lab coat, which is one that actually has special cinched wrists and has a material which is going to be resistant to liquids. The closest thing that I personally have to the lab coat pictured in this stock photo looks essentially exactly the same, but is bright blue. If you work with a flame really often, you'll get assigned a flame-resistant lab coat, which doesn't catch on fire as easily. Okay. I would have to guess that maybe this is a genetically modified organism. I'm going to give him a 0 in terms of his PPE and his animal regulations adherence. This doesn't seem like a great representation of what science is in terms of the laboratory. This guy might be allowed to do this. Who knows? This seems like a somewhat realistic situation. Obviously, he should be wearing gloves. Personal opinion, whatever. We've moved on from that. The recurrent thing of wearing goggles and a coat because it looks very sciencey, but then not wearing gloves, which would look more sciencey. So I'm not entirely sure why they don't do it. But yeah, here he has test tubes which have some sort of a dyed or fluorescent stained media that he's working with. Usually what would happen is you're not going to have a lot of things of a very different color, unless you're particularly testing things which are all very different. These might be very unique samples that he's dealing with, and each one does have a very different color. But ideally, you'd have replicates of the same thing, and those things would behave similarly in your experiment and would look very similar. And the one he's holding up, it actually is a separating. So you see like a purple dye separated from the clear liquid, and that is actually something you might be looking for. So I like that they're trying to add some dimension. He's actually fully dressed up. Most people are going to come into the lab probably wearing their pajamas or something that you can just hide under your lab coat. This guy, he's concerned about what he looks like. That's nice. I like it. This one I'm going to say is at least most accurate for PPE. They're fitted lab coats, and they're wearing gloves. Thankfully, they're finally wearing gloves, and they have their hair tied back. I am a little confused as to what exactly they're doing right here because they are clearly simultaneously pouring 2 different colored liquids into a shallow dish. Usually, I would expect to see one of these people with the dish placed onto the bench where you would be working with your experiment, probably pouring both things yourself. I haven't personally, ever needed to necessarily lift up a shallow dish of liquid off of the bench where it's least stable while I pour something else into it. But I mean, it's possible. I would say that this is maybe the most realistic situation we've seen yet. I can actually recognize this as not being a stock photo. This is probably a picture of something happening in an actual laboratory. And I'm guessing actually maybe not necessarily a laboratory, but a a lab that receives and maybe sorts chemicals, maybe a facility that might actually provide equipment to other labs. I'm not entirely sure, but what I do notice is that this guy, he's wearing full proper PPE. So you can see he's wearing his glasses, which are probably specific to him that he might have actually picked up when he got his PPE assigned. You can tell his lab coat has a name tag, which is specific to him. His lab coat has cinched wrists, so that's the first time I've seen a lab coat that looks like my lab coats. And he's properly wearing gloves, and those gloves are going over his cinched wrists, which is the proper way of wearing those. So yeah, great PPE. I like that. Um, and he's clearly working at a computer, which is supposed to be used in tandem with gloves and at a bench with chemicals. So that makes sense too. And the reason I think that this is the type of place where they actually receive chemicals and maybe sell them or distribute those chemicals or keep them logged. This computer has a barcode scanner, which means that they're probably assigning or checking the barcodes of the chemicals that come in. You'll notice, in contrast to the other very busy lab scenes we see where you have groups of people working very dynamically and it's a set of kind of tokenized Power Rangers. In this instance, nope, it's just this one guy. He came in with his job. And of course, the people in back, they all kind of look the same. It's just lab members. And the people in back are also wearing their proper PPE too, which is great. Yeah. I mean, I don't know if that might be the least realistic thing, because any vision you're going to get of a lab, you're probably going to see one guy wearing his lab coat and other people walking around eating cake or doing something completely unrelated. But here, it actually seems like it's a real picture and they're hard at work. So I like this. It's a good picture. This is kind of interesting. So a question you might ask is, do you actually ever build molecules in your laboratory? Like, do you ever build physical models? So, in fifth grade, when you actually kind of build models of molecules with the intention that will actually help you understand something about the molecules, you might actually find that that actually does happen in chemistry labs. It's done a lot with people who are engineering things. So biological engineers are going to be working with a lot of different um, uh, software programs, tools to build the things and models of the things that they're engineering. So in most cases, it might not necessarily be a physical model like this one, but you would probably be using some sort of software to model the molecule that you're curious in building. I personally had a chemistry professor who would allow you bring models to exams, and had a lot of models in his own labs, like physical toys, because it does really help you understand some things and work around some things conceptually. So yeah, I mean, this is pretty sciencey. I like the idea of helping people visually understand what you're working with, and this is a very kind of visceral picture. I like that. Pretty cool. I like this. So this is kind of fascinating. This guy's not actually dressed like a laboratory scientist. He's wearing medical scrubs. He's not dressed for a laboratory, even though this is definitely the most engaging laboratory experiment I've seen thus far. I really want to know what he's doing in this picture. I do work with a guy who is well on his way to being able to do ambidextrous pipetting. So working with both hands at the exact same time. Let's imagine you do have two syringes in both hands. Some people can do that. It's not super important if what you're doing is just doing like a lettuce and a yam or something and a potato. Usually you would want to learn how to be really, really efficient. If you have 500 samples you have to do something with really quickly. But yeah, this is kind of an interesting situation, and I would really like to know what's going on, but I don't think we ever will. A problem that I had with those other pictures is that none of the reagents were labeled. I wanted to be able to identify those liquids by the colors that they were. So in this picture, you have bottles which have some possibly not colored liquids in them, which are labeled with a label so that you can tell what it is. So that is a plus. All right, very sciencey. Thank you so much. And, always wear gloves. All right, have a good day, scientists.